It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the Young Professionals of the Americas 2022 Latin American Elections Preview. My name is Chase Harrison, and I'm an editorial associate at the American Society Council of the Americas Online, as well as a member of the internal committee of the Young Professionals of the Americas here in New York. For those of you who are wondering what YPA is, YPA is the Young Leaders Initiative of the American Society Council of the Americas. We're a network of young leaders from across industries and backgrounds with a common interest in Latin American politics, economics, business, investment, arts, and culture. This event is open to the public, and we're so glad you're all here. But if you'd like to learn more about YPA membership and more about all the great events and private events we throw throughout the year, you can go to as/coa.org/YPA to learn more. We'll also email out information after the program. We have a great calendar of events for 2022, including a innovator spotlight with an Argentine entrepreneur, Ezequiel Bungay, on February 17th that you won't want to miss. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our YPA global sponsors, BMW Group and BlackRock, and extend a special welcome to the members of the YPA steering committees in our 3 chapter cities, New York, DC, and Miami. 2021 was a year full of elections for Latin America. Amidst the backdrop of this everlasting pandemic, Latin Americans went to the polls, and we saw the rise of surprise figures like Pedro Castillo in Peru or Gabriel Boric in Chile. We saw 2 leaders win on their 3rd presidential campaigns, Lasso in Ecuador and Castro in Honduras. And we also saw democratic backsliding in Venezuela and Nicaragua. But before we even have a chance to catch our breath, 2022 is here with a new slate of elections. It feels like every year can be called Latin America's year of elections. Because this year we have 3 marquee presidential races in Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica. If you're looking for referenda, there's a lot of them this year. A potential referendum in Chile, a referendum in Uruguay on an ominous piece of legislation known as the Law of Special Consideration, and a presidential mandate referendum in Mexico. There's also local elections in Mexico, Peru, and Nicaragua. And if that wasn't enough for you, the ever influential United States will be hosting a midterm election in November. But don't get too overwhelmed because we have 2 fantastic speakers here today who are going to help us navigate all these races. The first is Sylvia Colombo. Sylvia is the Latin America correspondent for Folha de Sao Paulo, a Brazilian newspaper. She's Brazilian, but she's coming to us today from Buenos Aires, Argentina. We also have Will Freeman, a PhD candidate in politics from Princeton University. Will is on a Fulbright Hays grant, and so he's reporting to us from Bogota, Colombia. Before we get started with the conversation, just a quick roadmap. The 3 of us will discuss all these many elections for the first 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to any questions you might have. You can message your questions to the YPA events user in the chat here. Don't send it out to the whole group, just the YPA events user. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded, so we ask that you all keep yourself muted. And if you don't keep yourself muted, because it's being recorded, it will be immortalized forever. So we're going to try to avoid that. Without further ado, let's begin. I thought we would start with Brazil, which will have the largest election in the region. The first round of the election will be October 2nd, and there'll be a runoff on October 30th for presidential or gubernatorial races if no candidate hits a 50% threshold. Sylvia, the political climate in Brazil right now is marked by heavy polarization, and it's manifesting in this election. Right now, it seems like the race is going to come down to 2 presidents. Former President Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party on the left, and current President Jair Bolsonaro of many different political parties over his career on the right. How much is polarization defining the Brazilian election right now? How is it shaping the democratic process?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I'll try to make it short because Brazil is, as the other countries as well, is in a very complicated moment in politics and in economics and in other areas as well. Well, right now, as you said, it seems like the election would be about Lula against Bolsonaro, because if we see the polls, we see a clear leadership from Lula and Bolsonaro in second place, but none of them with enough votes to win in the first round. So much probably it will have a second round. Um, what I would say at this moment is it is very soon yet in this race. Yeah, we have 8 months, and in 8 months, a lot of things can happen. I think it's very unlikely that we could have a third name threatening these two candidates, because the ones that showed up till now didn't get a lot of uh, uh, voters and supporters. So it would be very unlikely to have this third candidate. Um, but we can still have some changes in the way this race will be disputed, because Bolsonaro is the president. He have a very bad image right now because of many things, because of the economic situation, because of the COVID situation. But he is still the president, so he can still do a lot of things, use the whole state apparatus to win supporters, like a program called Auxílio Brasil, in which he will basically distribute money to all the population. So his popularity might raise again, and turn this race between him and Lula pretty much disputed. So polarization is pretty strong right now in Brazil.
You mentioned the way that Bolsonaro might run his campaign using the apparatus of the state. I'm curious about Lula's campaign. One interesting development was that Lula said he's likely to pick on his ticket a conservative politician. And I
Yeah.
think both leaders are going to be trying to go for moderate voters or those Lula to Bolsonaro voters. What is Lula's campaign going to look like?
Yeah, this would be like the logic of politics, yeah, but that both of them should run to the center to look for voters. And this is not a problem for Lula. He had done this before. In other elections, he managed to have in his coalition conservative politicians, businessmen, people from the old politics. Uh, Lula it's a very intelligent politician in strategics. When you think about the strategics, no, now he's choosing a vice president that might be one of the politicians who ran against him in a previous election. So he has no problem in making alliances, and by now I think his electors are already used to this way of making politics of Lula. But the same does not apply to Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro, the his whole image and the whole construction of his character is based on being a radical guy, a guy who says things that are almost unbearable to a lot of people, but also sounds like the only truth in the planet to some other people. Yeah. So for him, for example, I've been asked the other day, do you think Bolsonaro will finally get vaccinated, or will finally accept that everybody must be vaccinated? Of course not, because if he does that, he loses the only thing that he still got, that it is this very radical, ideological group of voters that are still significant, around 25%. So it's very difficult to him for him to make a move to the center.
Thinking about Bolsonaro, he's backed by this strong right wing alliance of agribusiness, people passionate about gun rights, and the church, the evangelical church specifically. Will this coalition of right leaning groups be able to mount machinery that can fight off Lula and the Workers' Party, which has its own powerful network? Or has this movement somewhat died down since it emerged in 2018?
Well, this since 2018, this group has been fragmenting. You know, in the beginning, they were all with Bolsonaro because they, after 12 years, 13 years of PT, which is the party of Lula and Dilma, in the power. All money people, businessmen, agro money, they were all very interested in a change of economic policy, like for a more liberal policy, and they united against the PT option. And Lula could not run at that election because he was forbidden because of his problems with justice. So they all these people they gather around Bolsonaro. Right now, it's not the same case. You already have a lot of businessmen and a lot of people from churches and even the military that are accepting the idea of Lula, because Lula ruled and with these guys as well, even with the old politicians from the so-called Centrão, which are the clientelist politicians that manages the Congress. Lula also dealt with them when he was governing. So it's not it is not seen for him as a treason of his beliefs to deal with these people. So it will depend pretty much on the options that these groups that you mentioned do right before the election.
Something you mentioned was that in 2018, there was this powerful anti Workers' Party sentiment that helped carry Bolsonaro to victory. And
Mm.
a lot of pollsters are framing this vote sometimes as an anti vote. So it's less about loving a candidate and more about really not wanting Lula or really not wanting Bolsonaro. How much do you think that's defining the election? And does that present an opportunity for any of these third way candidates who are trying to frame themselves as a centrist, moderate, outside of the establishment candidate, like a Doria, Moro,
Mhm. Yeah,
Gomez?
you could think that because both of them have a lot of rejection, as you mentioned. Uh, I would say the rejection against Lula and the PT was stronger in the past. Now it still exists, but there are people who says no, but Bolsonaro is too much. We can have more of this. So let's have Lula again. But even though the feeling, the anti-PT feeling, is still very strong in Brazil, and the anti-Bolsonaro as well. So you could wonder, well, there will be a third candidate, some of them, yeah. So and we have a few options. There would not be a bad options if you look at the Brazilian political scenery. You have João Doria, who is a right-wing politician from São Paulo. He's the governor of São Paulo, and his major achievement was to bring. He was the first one to bring the vaccines, the anti-COVID vaccine, to Brazil. Then, if another candidate of the a right-wing candidate would be Sergio Moro, the judge of the Operação Lava Jato, who has a problem because he's seen as a traitor by both sides. Because at first he is the guy who basically put Lula in jail, and on the other hand, he joined Bolsonaro government, and then he left accusing Bolsonaro of corruption. So he's seen as a traitor by both sides. Then the other candidates, you have got good ones, like Ciro Gomes is a center left candidate who was candidate many times, but none of them in the last polls and in the last inquiries that were made with the population got more than 8 or 7% of the intention of vote. So we can only wonder that maybe Brazilian people want this polarization, because if they wanted someone else, there are options in the right wing, in the left wing as well. So this is what we have right now.
Hmm. And just shifting quickly from the presidential race to the fact that this is an enormous election in Brazil. Every
Yeah.
state is electing a governor, a state legislator, a third of the Senate seats are up for grabs. The entire lower house is up for grabs. So many local elections. Are the dynamics of these down ballot races going to be echoes of this presidential drama? Is it like a Lula versus Bolsonaro split no matter what race you're voting in? Or are we going to be seeing some of those different types of options that Brazilians may or may not want on the down ballot?
Yeah, Brazil is it's a huge country, yeah, and in this sense, it looks a lot like Mexico if you analyze this regional elections. So there are some regions in which you have very strong uh, familiar clans, familiar political family political clans, or politicians that are in are not a family but are in the power for a long time and manages to get people to vote on them or their chosen ones. And in these states, it kind of doesn't matter who the president would be, but because these states follow their own logic. But there are other states that in which this happens, and I would say that in the most important ones, most important financially, economically, and with the number of votes, they kind of mirror the national election. It's the case of Sao Paulo, which is the biggest electoral place in Brazil, and it is a place in which PT has a lot of rejection. So in São Paulo, it is going to be like a electoral war, and in Rio this happens a lot as well. I mean, it's very important for the president of Brazil, who is the governor of Rio, São Paulo, Porto Alegre, all these key states. So you have different situations depending on the states.
I'm going to ask one final question on Brazil, though we have 8 months to talk about it, so there's time for more questions in the future. But what are some of the substantive issues that you're going to be watching to see how this election plays out? Is it the economy, COVID? What sorts of issues?
I think the economy is the most important one, because we have before the COVID crisis, we had another big recession. Yeah, I think you would remember, people will remember that we had the impeachment of President Dilma, followed by an improvised government. So this brought a lot of instability, political instability to the country, and that reflected on the economy. So the economy was not doing good before the pandemics, and the pandemics made it worse. So we have high numbers of unemployment, and we have recession. We have our currency is very devaluated. So economy would be something that people would look and be worried about. Inflation is high, unemployment is high. This would be the main concern. And apart from that, I would say in the big cities, that security is always something that people are asking for in São Paulo and Rio, and also the pandemic. But right now, I think Brazil kind of went through the worst phases of the pandemic, uh, and we have now a good vaccination rate, so things are we never know with COVID. Yeah, it can always happen. Appear some new variant and change everything. But the numbers are more uh, uh, it started to get better in the sense.
Mm. I'm going to move backwards in size and the calendar. We're going to talk about Colombia. So, Colombia has a presidential election this year, but the calendar is a little interesting. On March 13th, there will be legislative elections as well as inter party consultations, which are like primaries for different ideological factions in the country. Then a first round election on May 29th with a 50% plus one threshold, and a June 19th runoff if no candidate reaches that threshold. Will, Colombia's had a rough few years. We saw in the spring these big protests break out about police brutality, but about a large frustration there is across the country with the stagnation of the government. 4 years ago, when Ivan Duque was elected, he was thought to be this breath of fresh air, but he has some of the lowest approval ratings in the region. You're coming to us from Colombia right now. I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of what the atmosphere is like on the ground. Are people excited for these three election dates that are coming up?
Thanks so much for that opening question, Chase, and really just thank you for having me here. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to this audience about the elections coming up in Colombia. Um, in terms of the mood of whether the country's excited about elections, I'm not sure I would pick that word. I think there is a lot of concern that what these elections are going to do is reproduce a very familiar dynamic where despite having the rhetoric of outsiders, being a breath of fresh air, being an independent candidate, that we might see elected a president who makes alliances with all the sort of powers that be already. So I think that there's a sense of cynicism about the prospects for real political change to come out of these elections, either in the Congress or in the presidency. And we can talk about the reasons why later. In terms of the issues that have been dominating the discussion here, um, Colombia is obviously not a post-COVID country. No country is, right? Nor is it, I would say, post-conflict. In fact, violence has been getting much worse here, especially in the countryside. But I think the electoral politics and the discussion around this election, it's been surprising to me to the extent to which the country's history of internal armed conflict and also the pandemic have really faded into the background of the discussion. Instead, you're seeing three different issues take the fore. Those are corruption, uh, the economy, and criminal violence or urban insecurity. And I think that voters here are looking for a candidate who can speak credibly to those three issues and offer what looks like, a concrete, doable solution to those. Just to expand a bit on the first issue on corruption, it was striking to me watching the presidential debate among all these candidates you mentioned, over a dozen of them, a week and a half ago, that every single question that the moderators asked, the candidates turned it into a question on corruption. Corruption must have been, kind of the most the frequently spoken word of the night. And I think there's some reasons for that. Of course, in the 2010s, we saw a wave of anti-corruption momentum sweep over South America, especially after the Odebrecht revelations. I think in many ways that wave skipped Colombia, and we're seeing the consequences of it now. Here, there were fewer high-level politicians and business people investigated and prosecuted for Odebrecht than in Ecuador, than in Peru, than in Brazil, than in many other countries in the region. There's a lingering frustration about impunity for corruption, which fueled the protests that you were mentioning last year. In terms of crime and violence, the homicide rate in Colombia jumped in a striking way last year. Insight Crime just put out a roundup of reporting on the homicide rates around the region. Colombia was virtually tied with Mexico. It was its worst year in 7 years. And last year there were over 90 massacres in Colombia, mostly in the countryside. So of course security is becoming kind of a major theme in the elections. And then finally, in terms of the economy, I think there's a real sense here that the whatever sort of economic recovery we might have seen in the wake of COVID, it's not sustained and it's not profound enough to solve people's everyday problems. The Colombian peso is now worth half what it was in 2019 in terms of US dollars. The informal economy is still very battered by the long-term shutdowns, very strict COVID measures that we're taking here. And basically voters are looking for a candidate who can credibly say, I have a solution to restarting the economy and more equitably distributing economic opportunity. Um, So that kind of gives you a sense of the major issues that are dominating discussion now. If you'd like, then we can, we could get more into the candidates' proposals on those, and then also where they're standing in the polls. Because I'd say the big contrast with Brazil here is that we still have so much uncertainty about who's going to make it, who's even going to come in first in that, or second in that first round election you mentioned coming up.
Yeah, Will, you said it. There is a giant field of candidates right now from across the political spectrum. On the three issues you mentioned, are different ideological camps trying to increase the salience of certain issues? Is it the case that certain issues are stronger for the right, center, or left, or is everybody speaking on all three of these issues?
That's a good question. I would lean towards saying that all candidates are trying to speak to all of them. In the debate that I referenced from a week and a half ago, I was surprised to the extent that every candidate is trying to portray herself or himself as the candidate of change. So every candidate wants to sell themselves as sort of a reformer who's going to, finally cut through the maquinaria and the sort of politics as usual approach to handling these issues. And I think every candidate from the right to the left to the center has tried to portray the others as complacent on these issues, is not willing to sort of take the bold and maybe unconventional measures necessary to make progress on them. So I don't see what the left or the right kind of trying to push the salience of one issue more than the other at this point.
One of the changes from this year to 2018 is that for the first time ever, there will be an inter-party consultation or a primary vote for the center. So in 2018, there was just the left and the right. But in the 2018 election, you saw Sergio Fajardo, who portrays himself as a pragmatic centrist, almost make the runoff. He was a little under 2 points off. So how much does the presence of this new center inter-party consultation change the dynamics of this election?
Hmm. Here's where I'd say I notice a big difference between the way this election is being written about and spoken about outside Colombia and inside Colombia. I'd say outside Colombia, especially in the English language press based in the US, there's a lot of excitement and focus on the Coalición Centro Esperanza, this group of centrists. It's not to say that there aren't many centrist voters in Colombia and that many people here would prefer a centrist candidate to come out ahead, but I think there's a lot more sense of cynicism and sort of a loss of hope about what this center coalition could produce, especially over the last few weeks. I'm sure that many of you saw that in this most recent debate, Ingrid Betancourt, one of the candidates, accused Alejandro Gaviria of basically breaking an agreement that they'd had not to run with maquinaria, or essentially political machines, usually run by family clans in the regions of Colombia. Whether or not that allegation was fair, we could discuss. But that her exit from the coalition, I think, only intensified this sense that the center is more susceptible to infighting than either the left or the right. In fact, what really struck me watching this debate was that Gustavo Petro and Fico Gutierrez, one of the candidates of the right, were seated next to each other. And, they were smiling at each other, occasional pat on the back. Meanwhile, it was the center that actually blew up into, almost sort of a screaming match. So I think that there's not that right now there's not very high chances that the center will resolve its disputes and kind of all rally behind one candidate, and that what that probably sets us up for, although again, I think there's a lot of unpredictability here and a lot could change last minute, is for Petro to remain strong in the polls. He's currently the leader, and then for a candidate, either an independent like Rodolfo Hernandez, or one of the candidates of the right, perhaps Fico Gutierrez, to emerge, on top as we're moving into the final weeks after the consulta.
It would be an interesting development because last year, several Latin American elections ended up with runoffs between the most extreme candidates, and those middle candidates fell out in the first round. One candidate who gets a lot of international attention and who's leading in the polls is Gustavo Petro, who's of the left, but a lot of people say of sort of this older school Latin American left. I'd love to hear about how generational dynamics map onto some of these shifts you're talking about in the ideological camps in Colombia. Are young Colombians perceiving this election in a different way than older Colombians?
That's a good question. First, I'd like to discuss Petro a little bit himself, because I do think that it's a very worthwhile question whether or not what camp of the left does he fall into? And in a way, I think, given that it's almost guaranteed that he will make it into the second round, it'll be him versus someone. I think that's going to be one of the most important questions to answer in this election. And on the one hand, you're right that he's often been discussed as part of an older left, occasionally being an apologist for authoritarian regimes in Venezuela, uh, and sympathetic to illiberal sort of leftism elsewhere. And of course, he just has a long political career. I mean, and in many ways, he's sort of the most visible face of opposition to Uribismo, or the political movement of right-wing ex-president Alvaro Uribe, and has been for many years. But I do think there are very interesting things going on right now that make it hard to continue to categorize him as far left or old left. I think we need a new vocabulary here. If there's one sort of comparison I would make to explain how Petro has been changing, I think he's been adopting the strategy of Mexican President Andres Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. This is actually a comparison that Ken Frankel made in a recent event. But what's similar with AMLO's route to the presidency and Petro's is that Petro, for many years, was sort of iconoclast, refused to make alliances with, figures who would ideologically be opposed to him. That's really changed in the last couple of years. He's finding allies even among former supporters of, former elite supporters of ex-president Uribe, which has shocked many. At the same time, Petro has been moving far to the right on social issues, becoming more of the sort of, I think, a breed of leftists we're seeing increasingly in South America, such as Pedro Castillo, who combines left-wing economic talking points with social conservatism. You've seen that, for instance, in Petro's unwillingness to sort of stand up for reproductive rights in Colombia. And it's also his criticism of sort of what he describes as an out-of-touch, very privileged type of urban feminism, instead of what he claims is a sort of more nationally encompassing feminism that his movement is supposedly trying to advance. So I think that it's hard to say right now if Petro is it really, what camp of the left he falls into. He still does emphasize climate quite a bit, which makes him seem a bit like some of the younger, more moderate leftists. But in terms of trade and economic policy, he looks still a bit more conventional left. And then again, on these questions of social issues, almost looks more like a conservative. And just to come to your point about, or your question about how young people are relating to the election, I think there's a fair amount of disillusion here. Now, that might have an urban bias because of the people I'm talking to here in Bogota. But I think there's a disillusion with the kind of compromises that many candidates are making in order to get closer to the first and second round, sort of real politique, or striking alliances like the ones I just discussed with Petro that are ideologically confusing. So I don't think there's a clear candidate who's sort of the pick of younger Colombians universally.
I wish we had more time to talk about Colombia, but we have to keep working our way back on the calendar to the most upcoming election, which is that in Costa Rica. Just coming up this Sunday, there'll be a first round presidential election where a candidate just has to get 40% to win, and it doesn't seem like any of the candidates are close. Nobody's polling above 20%. In 2018, Costa Rica had somewhat of a surprising election when a conservative evangelical movement propelled the candidacy of Fabricio Alvarado into the runoff. He didn't win the runoff, but he's back again this year. I'm wondering, are his supporters back? Are we going to see a repeat of the sort of issues that dominated the 2018 election in Costa Rica? Or has the landscape changed in the past 4 years? This goes out to either of you.
I don't know.
I can offer 2 cents here. Oh, sorry. Sylvia, were you about to comment?
I was just comment that I think that he was stronger in the previous election, and he won the first round in the previous election, and he lost at the end for Carlos Alvarado. So the scenario is pretty much unpredictable, as you're saying, Chase. We have 25 candidates with very low numbers, but it's kind of what happened in 2018 was something that changed the bipartisan model of Costa Rican politics, and now this is coming in back. Yeah.
Right, because it used to be this somewhat bipartisan system between the PLN and the PUSC, but for the past 2 elections, other parties have won, broken through. Will, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add that, well, I think it's true that you've noticed this sort of weakening of bipartisan tradition in Costa Rica, as in many ways, Costa Rica was late to that party. I mean, look at countries like Venezuela, where that happened 20 years prior, or there's, or El Salvador more recently. There's plenty of examples of once stable two-party systems starting to break down. What strikes me as so interesting and unique about Costa Rica is that those parties haven't completely collapsed. Despite being implicated in some corruption scandals, despite voters turning away for a while, they seem to be willing to come back. And I think there's some sort of an interesting story there to be told about how these traditional Costa Rican parties might have earned sort of a deeper, more resilient legitimacy, precisely because they've been more attentive to issues of inequality and kind of making the state work for ordinary people than, traditional parties elsewhere in the region. It's interesting right now that, as you were mentioning, Chase, the Jose Maria Figueres, the leader in the polls, is from one of these traditional parties, has had a long political career himself. Lineth Saborio, another of the leading candidates, is from a traditional party. And the question then is, if Fabricio Alvarado will be able to have sort of this repeat, ride this wave of sort of populist social conservative sentiment, potentially to victory. I also see it as quite unlikely. It's also worth noting that he's changed his messaging this time around. It's not that he's no longer a firebrand evangelical social conservative, but he's been talking a lot more about sort of the issues of poor Costa Ricans and solving economic issues. So, I wonder if, I guess maybe on his part, that's an attempt to gain a larger following. But it'll be interesting to see if he can compete while still kind of leaving behind or less prominently focusing on the issue of opposing marriage equality that initially earned him his large following.
Right. And not only do we have some more conservative evangelical candidates, but there's also, progressive, more environmentally focused candidates. So I think that this Sunday's first round will be really interesting. And then we'll see April 3rd, who comes out on top. I'd like to just zoom out a little bit to talk more generally about the state of elections in the region. As I noted at the beginning, 2021 saw a lot of elections, and there's been a lot of think pieces and post-election generalizations made. What do you two think were the most notable trends of 2021 elections? And do you think these will carry over to 2022, or is this a whole new electoral landscape?
I think a lot of things started to change in Latin America in 2019, actually, not in elections, but in protests in the streets. You had many countries that went out to the people got out in the streets to basically question the relationship between society and state, like trying to establish another connection between politicians and society. And this happened in Colombia, this happened in Chile, this happened in Ecuador, in Bolivia. Each one of these countries had its context. For example, Chile went to the streets because of the social the pension system and the education system. In Ecuador, people went to the streets because of indigenous rights, indigenous sovereignty. So each country has its particularities, but anyway, everybody went to the streets to ask for something different. And I think in the following years, the last one, 2021, and this one, 2022, we are seeing some of the consequences of this protests getting concrete, like the election of Gabriel Boric in Chile.
I would just follow up by saying there's really three things I've noticed about elections over the past year, couple years. One is that I think, many of you will be familiar with the idea of Castro-Chavismo, this sort of slur, if you're willing to look at it that way, of kind of accusing left of center candidates of somehow harboring sympathies with Cuba or Venezuela, right? And being
yeah.
exactly being really wolf in sheep's clothing. So I think that the narrative of Castrochavismo did a lot to affect elections in the 2010s, especially the latter half of the 2010s in Latin America. Of course, you saw it first come to bear on elections here, the last Colombian elections, where Petro was portrayed as a Castrochavista to, a pretty strong electoral effect. You've seen even before that, you saw sort of similar allegations being made against Ollanta Humala in Peru, but this was always sort of a narrative that somehow entered the conversation that ended up hurting left-wing candidates. If you will, was kind of a hangover from the left tide that swept over Latin America in the 2000s, and the genuine sort of mistakes and then deeply disturbing outcomes that came about in some countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua among them. But I think that narrative of Castrochavismo has less and less purchase. So in the past year, we saw right of center parties and candidates try to invoke the idea that leftists were somehow potentially wolves in sheep clothing or Castrochavistas in Chile, in Honduras, and in Peru. And in none of those places did those appeals seem to make much of a difference. So I think that's opening a route to the left again in Latin America. In some cases, a moderated left or sort of a young left, as in Chile, maybe in other cases, an older left. But I do think we're seeing the pendulum start to swing back again, even if now there's no one wave of left or right wing government sweeping the region. Second is I think we're seeing a weakening of parties almost everywhere, which makes elections extremely fluid and unpredictable, and also makes the final mile in elections extremely consequential. You can just look at two of the elections last year. Neither Boric nor Castillo were favorites to win their elections for months ahead of time. But what they did is they did a very good job of appearing in the media in the final weeks and selling themselves as sort of outsiders who maybe were worth taking a chance on. So I think that we're going to, as parties continue to grow weaker, I think we're going to have a harder and harder time saying what's going on with elections until the weeks or days before. And finally, I would say that I think the language of left and right it's getting harder and harder to apply to Latin American politics. I'm sure a lot of you saw today. There was a picture of Bolsonaro putting his arm around Pedro Castillo, in fact, wearing Pedro Castillo's signature hat. I'm sure, I don't know about the rest of you, I was deeply confused by that. It does not make sense with their policies, certainly with their discourse. But there you have, the photographic evidence that left people, politicians purportedly on the left and the right in Latin America seem very willing to publicly work together. Again, as I mentioned, here in Colombia, that's been a dynamic with the Petro campaign. What that means for electoral politics, I think, is uncertain. On the one hand, you could see a diminishing of sort of these labels and their significance as facilitating pragmatic deal making to get things done. But a more cynical and I think realistic way to look at it is that this opens the door to all kinds of opportunism, and it makes it very hard for voters to know who they're really electing, as the case of Peru makes painfully clear.
Well, I too saw that photo, but I think if Pedro Castillo offers you his gigantic hat, you got to put the hat on. I'd love to do that. We're going to move on to audience questions. We've gotten several already that I'm going to read out, but you can message YPA events in the chat and we'll get to your question. We're going to start with a question on Colombia. So Gustavo Perez of Mambu asks, is the implementation of the peace process part of the campaign debate? Will, what do you think?
I think it has the implementation or non-implementation itself has affected issues which are now contributing to shaping the race. But I don't think, you haven't heard the words peace accords come up very much in the debate or discussion around the elections, almost to a shocking extent, especially because obviously they're mixed implementation, in some cases, in some parts of the accords, non-implementation in the last few years has had very extreme consequences. The murder of hundreds of social leaders, an agrarian reform that really never, land reform that never got off the ground, and a special jurisdiction for the peace, the HEP, which is frequently under political attack. But I would say that I'm for one, it's just my opinion, I'm surprised by the extent to which we're not talking about it. It seems like even candidates of the right, Zuluaga, for instance, have sort of accepted that it's now part of the fabric or framework of Colombia. I will say, for the counterfactual, had the Duque government more fully implemented all the provisions of the peace accords and really made a full steam ahead approach with this, it might have had consequences that would keep it live as a political issue. So I think that its under implementation helps explain why a broader range of candidates seem now sort of consigned to say, well, that's already part of the institutional architecture here, and we're going to speak to the issues of as I mentioned at the beginning, corruption, economy, and crime that seem to be dominating the election so far.
Which is interesting considering several candidates in the field have pretty direct ties personally to the conflict. We're going to move on to a question about Brazil. This comes from Osiris Okondo of Bayer Company. Sylvia, he asks, if we consider the historical situation and result in the polls, is it possible that in the coming months, any of the other candidates besides Lula and Bolsonaro will gain traction? This has been a situation in other countries in the region. Wonder if this is possible based on voter dynamics in Brazil. And I'm thinking about certain races like Chile's, where they said it's definitely going to be these two candidates. And then a couple months later, it was figures that came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter, and journalists are not very good futurologists. Every time we try to talk about the future, it's not very much recommended. We can talk more easily about what we saw, but I think it would be very unlikely, as I said before. But there are things that happen in the middle of the process. For example, in the last election, maybe Bolsonaro would win even without being stabbed, as he was. I think you remember he was stabbed during the campaign. That helped him a lot because he was out of the debates, he was out of criticism, he was protected from criticism, and that helped him to win. So events that are non-political, for example, like one candidate being sick or stabbed or some accident. In the previous election, we had one candidate who died in a plane crash, Eduardo Campos. These things could change the scene, the scenario. But if we are going to talk about what these small candidates could do to take Lula or Bolsonaro from the second round, I think they can do not much. I don't see them doing this. They are trying. Some of them are trying to be more Lula-like. The other are trying to be more Bolsonaro-like, to see if the angry Bolsonarists vote in him, or the angry Lulis vote for the other. But it's not working. So I would say that this could happen only if something non-political, as an accident or assassination attempt happens.
A little bit morbid, but I think, as we all know, anything can happen in Latin American politics, for sure.
Yeah, and we have 8 months, yeah?
We have 8 months, yeah.
Mhm.
Our next question comes from Mario Di Giovanni of FedEx. They ask, to Will's comments, I have not seen that the left versus right in LatAm is as black and white as it is in the US or Europe, in separating social versus economic approaches. You have the case of Boric, a left-leaning president-elect, who is more typical leftist in the social aspect, but chose a more centrist economist, tapping Mario Marcel to be his finance minister. Is this trend widespread in Latin America, or is it more focused on South America than Central America? This trend of maybe left socially, but more center or right economically?
It's a very good question. Left socially, but center right. Well, I think you get both pairings, right? So you also get the sort of type AMLO types, or, well, in a sense AMLO, but certainly Castillo, who are, or maybe Petro now, who are socially conservative but more statist economically, more traditionally leftist. I think it goes both ways, and I think I think that the root cause of this is the weakening of parties. So candidates are kind of more free to mix and match ideologically. They're not tethered to a party or its platform, or sort of a fixed constituency of voters who identify as partisans and expect a certain mix of policies to be regularly presented by their parties. So I think in that sense, it's certainly a trend in South America. In Central America, I think it's hard because I don't really know what the left, I don't know, besides Honduras, I think it's hard to talk about sort of an electorally viable left. You have in Guatemala, the left historically weak. Maybe Semilla, this new political party, will have some kind of force in the next elections, but it has a long way to go. In El Salvador, the FMLN has completely collapsed. In Honduras, of course, there is the exception, which we haven't talked about yet, which is notable, of Libre. But I would say Libre, it looks like a pretty conventional left. So I think the verdict's still out on whether or not this is only a South America phenomenon or it's something broader. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see more bizarre ideological pairings precisely because parties are weakening everywhere.
It's really interesting. We have another Brazil question coming in from Camila Mendoza of Kellogg. She asks, do you think that among Brazil's priorities with any of the candidates is to continue its leadership in Latin America, as in recent years, or aim at more leadership outside of the continent? So Latin American leadership versus global leadership.
I don't think this was ever something that the Brazilian leaders wanted, like for like a flag, a political flag. Apart from Lula, in his time, in his presidency, he tried to be like the leader of Latin America. Yeah, he made friends. It was the so-called pink tide. So he was trying to unite with other left-wing leaders like Hugo Chavez, Nestor Kirchner, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, and even with a lot of investments from Brazilian state, try to be more present in these other countries. But I don't see this happening now. I see all the countries with a lot of internal issues, internal economical problems, and I don't see countries trying to be leaders of the region. And you also see like a union like Mercosur is falling apart. Yeah, it started with a lot of illusions that the South Cone would be like a economic potent partner in world economics, and now you don't have it. Even Uruguay wants to leave to make a free trade agreement with China. So not even Uruguay wants to be with Brazil and Argentina. So it's kind of each one is looking for its own problems. That's how I see it now. I don't know.
We have a question from Enrique Sanz Posse of JP Morgan. And sorry, just before I ask this question, we have time for a couple more questions. So send them in. We can hit any of the countries, even ones we haven't discussed. By now, you know how knowledgeable our panelists are. Enrique Sanz Posse of JP Morgan asks, question on Colombia. Are economic institutions robust to an election? That is, how difficult will it be for the next candidate to change them and to mold them to fit his agenda, such as a populist agenda?
It's an excellent question, and I have to admit up front, I don't feel the most informed to answer this in a deep sort of way. But I'll make a few comments. There have been concerns lately about the independence of the central bank leadership. Allegations that the Duque government has really, won it over to its side. And I think there's concerns about the robustness of economic institutions, their independence already being under some kind of threat. Now, I think I get implicitly from the question, I think the scenario we're all imagining here is that Petro wins and he wants to substantially change what's been a pretty market-friendly economic model in Colombia for a long time. I think that we need to temper our anxieties there. I don't actually see Petro either having the vision of implementing kind of a radically statist economic agenda or the capacity, because we also haven't spoken about this, but there are congressional elections coming up. Over half of the candidates have been linked to kind of traditional regional family clans in Colombia or are running on their behalf. Any way you look at it, there's not going to be some kind of like sweeping, mandate for change in Congress. So I think that'll act as a real constraint on making any radical changes to institutions, economic or otherwise, coming up. So I think that the kind of changes you'll see on economic institutions will probably be at the margins, and to the extent that it's possible, they'll be accomplished through executive decrees, not through sort of sweeping legislation that would really have the power to change things.
To ask maybe a final question of the two of you, up top I mentioned all the referenda, local elections, a US election. What else are you going to be watching for this year when you're thinking about the region as a whole? What elections are maybe not as high profile as Brazil, Colombia, or Costa Rica, but still big deals?
I think the Chile referendum of the constitution would be pretty much important. And even if it goes wrong, I think it can end Bodic's dream and Bodic's government, because he's the face of all this movement, and the people who elected him was mostly the people who wants the new constitution. So if it doesn't pass, and if it doesn't turn out the way these people want, I think Boric will have a lot of problems to end this government, to finish this government. So I think it's very important. And on the other hand, it is important because it will change the constitution that was from Pinochet era. And Chile was a model for a certain kind of right-wing politicians in Latin America. So I think we should watch closely what's going to happen in Chile in the second semester.
Will, do you have a quick last thought?
Yeah, I would say, if it's a fair response to the question, I'd say that I'm still watching very closely an election outcome, which might formally be over, but I think we don't yet know really where it's headed, which is Honduras. So that's an interesting case, right, where against all odds, Xiomara Castro won a 20-point landslide over an entrenched authoritarian ruling party. That's just something you'd hardly see anywhere in the world, let alone in Latin America, where oppositions in Venezuela and Nicaragua have tried the same for years under even harder conditions, and have rarely been able to win deeply unfair elections. It's remarkable that Castro did it, and it's interesting to see the extent to which the Biden administration has really hung its hat on saying we're going to support this, the Castro administration, and work with the Castro government to try to solve root causes of migration from that part of the Northern Triangle. But I think that we really have yet to see if Castro will be able to remain in office, what she'll actually be able to do in terms of implementing reforms. So that's an election which, while technically over, I think we're going to still be hearing a lot about the consequences of it throughout this year.
Great, looking forward and looking backwards as we sit here in February of 2022. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for our 2022 Latin Americans election preview. If you'd like to learn more about the young professionals of the Americas, you can go to as-coa.org/YPA. And as I mentioned, we're going to email out information after the program concludes. We have such a great year of programming. We have such a great network of people, and we'd love to see you all join us again. We have two events coming up. Our Innovator Spotlight with Ezekiel Bunge on February 17th, and we're co-hosting the Latin American Business Association Conference with keynote speaker Horacio Larreta on February 25th. So I hope to see you all at both of them, and have a great day.